All right, Daf Tzadi Hey, Monday's Daf. And the Gemara yesterday was talking about the Genevas Das issue. And the last thing we had learned yesterday was Rava's memra of Ihu Dekomitoi Nafshe, that he is misleading himself. Not that I'm saying the wrong thing and misleading him, but he's just doing this to himself. They are not reading the situation correctly, and I'm not mechuyev to correct. So I just wanted to share, I heard a nice Maramokim from Rav Asher Weiss that he told about himself, that since he regularly says Shirim in Yerushalayim, but one time he had to be in Bnei Brak for some kind of a tzarech, and he heard that when he was in Bnei Brak, one of his Talmidim was making a chasna. So he stopped by the chasna. The Talmud was overwhelmed that his Rebbe, Rav Asher Weiss, came to the chasna. So Rav Asher Weiss said about that story that the fact that my Talmud thought I came special for him, it's inhu dekomato nafshayu. He told himself that I came for him. I'm not mechuyev to burst his bubble and say, hey, I was here in town anyway. So it's not a Genevas Das to let him think this. I just find this to be incredibly useful, this little Meiser Rav, because I travel a lot and I have this kind of situation myself. So we're saying if I'm in Lakewood anyway for a shoot, and now I stop into Nimas Achayim to say Mazel Tov to the Baal Simcha, and he's going to think to himself, wow, Kramer schlepped all the way from my chasna, I'm allowed to let him think that. I'm not sure I would, but I'm just saying it's nice to know that I could. Anyway, we're picking it up at the very bottom line over here on Tzadi Dalet Amud Beis. Hahu tabocha de omer le lechavre. There was a sheichet who said to his buddy, and we're going to see he's not such a buddy based on the story here, moving over to Tamid Aleph, I havis paisis minai, if you would be a better friend of mine, miloi safuye lach misharshal petem de of the esmel. I would have given you for some of the geshmaka flesh from my shchita yesterday. So Amar Lei, the guy said, Achli mishufri shufri. I had the best parts. Oh, so Amar Lei, so the sheichet says back, well, minolach, how'd you get your hands on my meat that I shechted? Amar Lei, the guy responds, says, well, there's oven plainly davikacham v'safali. I went to the butcher shop where the guy was selling it to me. As we explained yesterday, rive of the sheichtim were yidden, but the actual employees that are in the store who are actually selling the meat could be guyim. So I bought the meat from the guy, and therefore I bought that geshmaka meat that you're talking about. So Amar Lei, zok the sheichet, trei avdi. I actually shechted 2 animals. V'hahu treifa avi. And the one that I sold to that store that the guy you bought it from, that was a treifa. Take that. So avdem, Omar Rebbe, bishvil shaitazeh, she'asa, shaloi kahigan anu neser kol hamakulin. Zok Rebbe, because of this shaita, who's the sheichet over here, who didn't act appropriately, we should aser all of the meat? Because based on what he's saying himself, he took a treifa and gave it to the goyim to sell, which of course would be machshel all the yidden. But based on Rebbe's response, it sounds like we're not going to aser the meat that he bought in the butcher shop, and that's Rebbe Latame Diomer, because Rebbe says in a brisa, Makulin v'tabche Yisrael, in a shtat where the stores are supplied by the Yiddish sheichtim, basar nimtza biyada v'keichav is going to be mutter. So that's Rebbe Lishitasei, that you do not have to worry about the chashash of not kosher meat in the marketplace. Now Rashi over here is madgish the fact that he's buying it in a store, and it sounds like because it's in a store, you can now buy the meat without any fear of it being not kosher. But if you're medayik from Rashi, that's dafka in the stores, it would sound like if you're buying from a guy in his home, it would be osir, because we're afraid that maybe the guy shechted it himself, and the Rashba takes issue with this Rashi because l'chayra you should be able to go basar raiv and say that the meat is kosher even if you're buying it not in a store. Okay, I'll go put him back to the Gemara Ikati Amri. There is another version of the story that Amar Rebbe had said, here you have a precedent to say that the sheichet who's trying to be metzar his friend and say, oh, I sold him a treifa animal, so on a neser kol hamakulin, we shouldn't believe the sheichet. So these two lashinas sound like it's a shaila, do we or do we not believe the sheichet in such a situation? And now the Gemara's medayik. It's only because we think the sheichet wants to be metzar his friend, but he never really sold the treifa, but holav hachi. If we did believe him that he sold the treifa flesh to the store, usr, then it would be usr to buy from the guy. In a place where it's raiv, Jewish sheichtim, you can now buy from the guyim. To which the Gemara says, Shani hachad es chazik isura. Buy the sheichet who sold this meat to the guy without the hachraza, and it's chazik isura. Now we have what to worry about, and therefore there's more of a makam to aser. Okay, new sugya. Omer Rav basar kimin shen nesal min ha'ayin is aser. If you take your eyes off the meat, it's going to be aser. And what are we talking about? So Rashi explains that we are afraid that the birds would swoop down and swap out the meat for other meat that might not be kosher. It seems like a pretty far-fetched chashash, and we're going to see this is only a chashash ba'alma. The Rishonim speak out, this is not a real suffik iser, and therefore there's different kulas. Suffik basar nesal min ha'ayin is not going to be aser. Balkopanim Rav's halacha is, there is this chumrah, if it's nesal min ha'ayin, it is aser. Meisavei, Rabbi, Aimer makulin v'tabchi Yisrael basar nimtza b'yada kechavim is mutter. So as long as you can go basar the raiv, Yiddish shaychtim, the meat that you find by the goyim is going to be mutter. But lemaisa, it's nimtza by the goyim. That's for sure nesal min ha'ayin. Teretz says no, it's not really nesal min ha'ayin. Nimtza b'yaday v'kochav mishayni. It's still being watched by the goy. So there isn't any bird swooping in and swapping out the meat because it's being watched by goyim. Hayais is not about the nemonis of the goy. It's about the shmira. Toshma. Well, let's try again from the teisha chanuyas mekulan mechurais basar shchuta v'achas mechurais basar nevelas. You got the 10 stores, 9 of which are kosher, and now v'lokach me'achas mehen ve'eni yedem eizem mehen lokach. I don't remember where I bought it from, and I got this piece of meat in my hands. And which store did I come out of just now? Then it's feikai osir because it's kol kavul k'mechzal mechza. The latest suffix is in a makom of fias, and therefore I cannot go basar raiv. And based on Reb Chaim's chakira, either it's because there is no raiv, or because afal pi that there's a raiv, it's exeris akos if you say kol kavua. But no matter how you understand the mechanics of kol kavua k'mechzal mechza dami, it certainly is considered like half and half, and therefore suffix deraisa l'chumra by a case of a lokach achas mehen ve'ena yedem mehen lokach. But uben nimtza, let's say I find the meat, and pashas means like you found it in the parking lot. So the halach is holach achar raiv. That is the classic ruba deisa kaman that I could say kol de parish miruba parish, and we're clearly not afraid that a bird swooped down and swapped out the meat, even though it's definitely a salmon ayin because you found it. So hachinamim benimtza b'yaday v'kochav. According to Rav, this brisa teisha chanuyis is talking about where you found the meat not lying on the sidewalk, but it was in the hands of a guy. So it never was by itself that the birds could have swapped it out. And therefore you have no raya connected Rav from this brisa of teisha chanuyis about his halacha of basar shinasal min ayin. Toshma, let's try again from this mission in the second parak of machshirin. Matzah ba basar, let's say you find meat in a city that has both Yidden and Goyim. Holach achar raiv tapachim, you go basar raiv of the shaychtim. Vim mevushel, if it's already cooked meat, then holach achar raiv eichle basar. You go up basar raiv of the people who are not vegetarians. And therefore, if it's raiv yidin, you're allowed to eat the meat, even though it was nimtza. And lachera, therefore, we're not concerned with the basar shenasal min ha'ayin problem of Rav. And for the Gemara, v'chitem hachinam, you want to say also we're talking about where you didn't find it on the street, but rather it's been nimtza b'yaday v'kechavim. Well, then mevushel holach achar raiv eichle basar. Why would we say that you go basar after the meat eaters in the city if it's already mevushel? Then nextly, let's see, who's holding the meat? And since the Mishnah doesn't tell us whether or not who's holding the meat, must be it's mamish unsupervised meat that you found in the street, and therefore it's basar shenasal min ha'ayin that we don't seem to be concerned about Rav's halacha. And for the Gemara, a yid was watching it, so it was actually mishumer the whole time, and therefore no birds came along and swapped out the meat. Tashma, let's try bring a raya from the Mishnah in the 7th parak of Masechta Shkalim. Nimtza b'gvul, and let's say I find meat in the street outside of Yerushalayim. So avarim are neveles. If it's cut into different avarim, we have to assume that they're neveles, and therefore nobody sliced up the meat properly. It indicates that it was just kind of thrown out wholesale, and therefore it's still in an avarim matziv. But chaticha is mutar. So if it's nicely sliced up, it sounds like somebody did a proper shchita. And because raiv of the sheichtim in this town are yidden, I can now assume that this is kosher meat. Well, that's fine and dandy, but it's l'cheres basar shenasal min ha'ayin because you found it in the street. And now v'chitem hachinam yibayimid v'ra'ehu, and you want to tell me that we're talking in this Mishnah in Shkalim that another yid is watching it the whole time? Well, avarim neveles hamay. Then why does the Mishnah say if it was cut into a varim, you have to assume it's in the nevela? If it's being watched, you can assume that it came from a yid, even if it's a varim. And for the Gemara, midi hu taima elul Rav. Is this a kasha on anybody other than Rav? Ha itmar Allah, that Mishnah we said, Rav omer mutarais mishum nevela. It's taka mutar al nevela. You just can't eat it. In other words, it's not going to have tumas nevela, but doesn't make it mutar la'achila. And that's what Rav is saying the problem is. The Levi omer mutaris b'achila. Levi went ahead and extended that heter not just for tumah, but even for the achila. But you can't ask me a kasha on Rav, because Rav himself has a perfectly acceptable way of reading that Mishnah. Now continues the Gemara as a matter of historical record here. Rav never really said this halacha beferish alamachlola itmar. It was inferred from a maisa of Rav that we say basar shenasal min ha'ayin is aser. De Rav Havi Yosef amabra de ishtamtis. Rav was sitting on the Staten Island ferry crossing the Ishtatis River. Chaziel hu gavra, and he saw a person de havia kom turning over Tamid Bay's machaver reshe. He was pulling a head of a kosher animal out of the river. Maybe he dropped this head into the river. Nafal minei, the head fell out of his hands into the river, and also icy silta. And he brought up the basket and showed the asik train, and now there's 2 heads in the river. So Amar Rav, Avdi Nami Hachi, is this normal for this to happen? That you lose 1 head and you find 2? Which is his way of saying that clearly there were multiple heads in the water beforehand. And maybe that head came from a city where Raiv of the Sheichtim are not Yidden, and therefore it should be Osir. And therefore Asrinhu ni Hale. And even though 2 heads are usually better than 1, in this case, Rav answered it, and therefore Rav answered both heads for that guy who was doing his head fishing. Amar le Rav Kahana v'Ravasi l'Rav, d'isur shchichi d'hater le'shchichi. Is it only so shchich to have osar meat and not heter dika meat? I mean, l'chayra, raiv meat in this place is kosher. Raiv of the shechtim in this town are yidden. So Amar lu isur shchichi tvei. Rav said, in the velt, there's more treifa meat than kosher meat. But anyway, from the very fact that Rav held it was osar, it was because you couldn't see it, and even though it's not beferish itmar, it's mechlala itmar, that basar shinasal min ha'ayin will be osar. Now, v'chi mechlala mai, what other way could you have touched up the story that now you need to tell me the chiddush that this is what Rav's inference was from the story? And for the Gemara, because parvosa daivikechav mavoy. This port, this parvosa, was a place for goyim, and therefore the chashash might have been not the basar min ha'sal min ha'ayin, also the birds, but because of the fact that it could have been legitimately not kosher meat. And Teda, and I'll bring you a raya that could have been a proper way to explain what Rav meant, because the ka'omar lahu d'isur shchichi tvei, because there's more roiv meat in the velt. When I mean velt, meaning in this area, so there is a justifiable implication other than basar shinasal min ha'ayin being usher. So for the Gemara, Rav heichi ochel bisra. If Rav actually ushered the meat that was nasal min ha'ayin, how did he ever eat meat? And for the Gemara, b'shaita deloy olam eina minei. Maybe in a chanami, meat that he never took his eyes off it. It was taka never unsupervised. Or maybe he tied and sealed it. So it was inside of some sort of packaging that would not be able to be exchanged by a bird. Or v'inami b'simona. Maybe he put a simon on the meat itself, not in the packaging, but on the piece of meat. He would cut his meat into triangles, so therefore if a bird came and swapped it out, it wouldn't look like that. Rav havikazel lebei Rav Chanan chasone. So Rav was going to his Adam's house, Rav Chanan. Chazi mabra dekasi lape. When he got to the riverbank, he saw that there was a boat coming. Omar, mabra kasi lape yuma tavel lugav. Like the bus shows up when you get to the stop. The ferry just showed up when I got here. This is definitely a simon that today is going to be a good day. Ozil come abava. When he crossed the river and went to his son-in-law's house, oidik bebiz odedasha. He peeked through the crack in the door and chazi chayvasa detalia. And he saw geshachtan animals were hanging there in the house. Taraf abava. He knocked on the door of the house. Nafakasu kuli amalape. You can imagine the Gadol Ador Rav is here. Everybody came out of the house. Asa tabache nami. And even the sheikhtim who were preparing the meat also came out to greet Rav, and they left the meat without any supervision. So le'olam Raveinu minei. But Rav, who was standing there by the door, stayed focused like a laser looking at that meat. So Amar Lahu, Echu Hashta, he said to the sheikhtim, if I was saimach on your hashgacha, safisula isur lebnei bras, you would have fed not kosher meat to the sons of my daughter, meaning to my eneklach, because Rav held it's basar shinasal min ha'ayin. And the Gemara is off the story by saying lo yochel Rav mehu bisra. Rav did not eat from that basar, which might have made that suuda a tad awkward. Okay. So my time, why didn't Rav want to eat from that basar? Imishum ialume, if he held it was basar shinasal min ha'ayin, haloi ialim. But lemaisa, the story was that Rav never took his eyes off the meat. So l'cher, it's not basar shinasal min ha'ayin. Ela dedachish. Maybe you want to say it's because Rav didn't want to eat it because he was doing a nichush. He was saying, remember, today is going to be a great day because I got my ferry right away. That might be nichush. That's like the black cat just crossed my path kind of thing, and I'm using an omen, and we don't like nichush. But that can't be it because there's nothing wrong with this kind of nichush. Because v'amar Rav kol nachash she'ena Eliezer Eved Avram u'Yonasan ben Shaul ena nachash. Any kind of nichush that's not just like Eliezer Eved Avram, where he said if she does this kind of gemelas chesed, it'll be a shidduch for Yitzchak, or Yonasan ben Shaul, that's not considered nichush. And therefore Rav, who just said, it's a good simon that I got my boat, that's not nichush. And just as a side, the Ran over here in the Chidushei Ran says a very important rule that chas v'shalom to say Eliezer Eved Avram did real nichush. He was a tzaddik. And the same thing with Yonasan ben Shaul. The idea is that nichush is not going to be effective unless there's a logic to it. In other words, the black cat crossing my path is meaningless, and therefore for me to be soimach on that could be a problem with nichush. But if the girl on the date does some gemilas chesed, that is a simon that it's a good shidduch. So all we meant over here is that it has to be effective in that sense. But anyway, the Gemara's bottom line is elasudas harishus havoi. The reason why Rav didn't want to eat the meat is not because of a basar shinasal min ha'ayin problem or because of a nichush problem, but rather it was a sudas rishus. It wasn't a sudas mitzvah. Rav le'misani misudas rishus. Rav wouldn't eat meat in these kind of matzavim. He was a parish in that regard. And the Gemara ends off by saying regarding this nichush thing that Rav bodik b'mabra, that Rav would use whether or not the boat was there at the dock when he got there as a simon, whether or not it was a good one to get on. Shmuel bodik b'sifra, and Shmuel would use a sefer, which sounds like the Ger Lagra. And Rabbi Yechanan bodik b'yanuka, and Rabbi Yechanan would be able to kind of use a simon of if a pasuk was said by a child what he's learning in school, which we find many Gemaras like that. And now we're going to relate such a story. Kulu shani de Rav, during all the years of Rav's life, have a kosavle Rabbi Yechanan would write letters to Rav, L'kodem Rabbeinu Shebabavel, to our Rebbe in Bavel. When Rav died and Shmuel took over as the Gadol Hadar in Bavel, have a kasav l'Shmuel. Rabbi Yochanan would write in his letters to Shmuel, Kodam chavereinu sheba Bavel, to our colleague in Bavel. So Amar lo yoda li midi de Rabbi Ana. Shmuel said to himself, is there something that I don't know as much as he does, and therefore I shouldn't be considered his Rebbe? Why am I only his colleague? So Shmuel went out of his way now to impress Rabbi Yochanan. So kasav shadr le ibura de shitin shani. He wrote to Rabbi Yochanan the cheshbon of the calendar for the next 60 years. So Amar hashta chushbana bi'alma yadav. So Rabbi Yochanan wasn't so impressed. He said, big deal, so that's just cheshbonus. Kasav shadr le tleiser gamles feke trefasa. So Shmuel went ahead and sent Rabbi Yochanan 13 camel loads of shilas of trefus. Oh, that's impressive. Amar isli Rab bebavel eza chazye. So now Rabbi Yochanan started saying, I have a Rebbe in Bavel and I'm going to go see him. Amar le liyanuka, before going on this trip, he said to a child, Psaikli psukeich, tell me what you're currently learning. Amar le, and the kid said, Ushmuel meis, quoting the pasuk in the 28th parak of Sefer Shmuel. So Amar Shemami, no, nach nafshi de Shmuel. So Rabbi Yochanan actually took this as a simon. So you see that Psaikli psukeich is actually a legitimate way and it's not considered nichush. But the Gemara ends up by saying, "V'loihi leishachiv Shmuel taka didn't die. Ella ki hechid litrach Rabbi Yochanan." It was a simon min hashamayim because Rabbi Yochanan didn't want to have to schlep. So really, that was just kind of helping him along, and that's the reason why it said Shmuel Mace. Now, Rav Egros has an interesting ha'or over here that Shmuel was trying to impress Rabbi Yochanan about his knowledge of Trefus, and ultimately he does seem to imply that he knows more than Rabbi Yochanan about Trefus. But yet the Gemara earlier, I think it was Daf Mem, when the Gemara was giving the example of the Amira saying that my son knows Hilchas Trefus just like Rabbi Yochanan, and Rashi over there says, oh, Rabbi Yochanan is such an expert in Trefus, and brings our Gemara as the mucker. But really, if you're trying to show who is the expert in Trefus, the story is really illustrating how Shmuel was the true expert and not Rabbi Yochanan. So it's a nice ha'ara on this Gemara. Tanya, more about Nichush. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Bayis, Tinek, V'isha, those three things, a house, a baby being born, and a Isha, Afal Pisha ein Nachash, even though there is no working Nichush that actually will give you any actionable information, but still Yesh Simon. It'll be a good omen. Omer Rabbi Elazar, who deschazik tlosasim, it's only if it happens 3 times. Tichsiv Yosef enenu v'Shimon enenu v'es Benyamin tikachu. So that happened 3 times, therefore you're allowed to use that as a simon. Okay, back to Basar Shinasal Mena'ayin. Bo minei Rav Huna me'Rav. B'charuzin mahu. Let's say the pieces of meat are strung on a cable or a cord, and they're Nisal Mena'ayin. Do we have to be worried they're switched out by a bird? Omer le zok Rav al tihi shaita b'charuzin. Don't even ask such a foolish question. Harei is a simon. It is clearly a simon that the meat was not switched out. Ikati Amri Omar Rav Huna Omar Rav b'charuzin harei simon, and therefore it's not a problem even if it was nisal mina'ayin. Rav Nachman ben Ardoik lo legabi Rav Kahana lufum nahara b'mali yom dekipuri. Rav Nachman came to Rav Kahana on Erev Yom Kippur. Osu arve shadu kavde v'chul yasa. The arvin, the ravens, were throwing livers and kidneys into the streets. And Amar later, Rav Kahana said, Shkoil v'yachol. I guess it was Erev Yom Kippur, so it was a mitzvah to eat. So ha'idna de'hatera shchich tvei, because there's more kosher meat today, since there's so many shchitas happening, and therefore the birds are dropping meat. Now, l'char is basar shinasal mina'ayin, and therefore Rashi points out that he's arguing with Rav and saying there is no problem with basar shinasal min ha'ayin. Rav Chia bar Oven itvadle karkasha beini dana. That Rav Chia bar Oven lost a karkasha, which is a colon of a kosher animal, amongst these barrels in the wine cellar, and later on he found it. Also, l'kamed Rav Huna, he came to Rav Huna and said, is this the same kosher a colon that I lost? Or maybe it was swapped out for a different colon, and this is only a semicolon. Chick. Omar le islach simna begave. Or Rav Huna said, do you have any kind of simon that you can say this is the same colon? Omar le lo. I don't have any simon on this. Well, islach tvias eina begave. Maybe you did a colonoscopy and you can actually recognize this colon is yours. Omar le in. Yeah, taka recognize it. Sim kain zil shkoil. So Rav Huna said, if that's the case, go and enjoy your delicious colon lunch. Rav Chanina chayzah itabed le gaba de bis. Rav Chanina chayzah lost this back part of the kosher of flesh, and then he afterwards found it. Also, look at Rav Nachman. Am I allowed to eat it? Can I assume it's the same piece of meat that I lost? Amar le, islach simna begave. Do you have a simon? Amar le loy. But islach tvias eina begave. Do you recognize it? So Amar le in. I do recognize it. Sim kain zil shkel. Then you can have it. The last part we'll do for today. Rav Nosson bar Abaya itaped le kibura de tchelta. He lost a spool of tchelis thread. Then he found it. Also look at Rav Chizda. Amar le islach simna begave. Do you have a simon? Amar le loy. No, I don't. Islach tvias eina begave. Do you recognize it? Amar le in. I do recognize the spool of tchelis thread. Im kain zil shkel. So then he said, if that's the case, then you can use it for your tzitzis. We'll stop here and pick it up with Amar Rava for tomorrow's daf.